So we know you have done a lot of work on housing or experiments in urban design. So what we want to hear from you, could you tell us a little bit more your work on housing?
Yes, I wouldn't call myself a housing expert. I have looked at housing from a planning point of view, in particular on major development schemes, and also chaired design review panels, which obviously you consider the quality of the housing as central to that.
So what do you think about the quality of new housing in London and in England in general?
It's pretty bad, to be honest. No, I mean, it falls into various categories. Obviously, there's the volume house builders, and in particular outside London. The low density housing estates are, generally speaking, dreadful. Unimaginative, poor architecture, no landscape, dreadful layouts, totally unsustainable in terms of density. And we talk about sustainability in housing, but unless you're building at about 110 to 120 dwellings per hectare, you're not going to be sustainable. An awful lot of developments happening on urban peripheries or green belt are round about 30 to 35, which means they're locking in car-based transport for 50, 60 years, probably longer. And when they say, oh, we'll have a cycling strategy, well, they won't, because that just you can't superimpose that on a development that's fundamentally unsustainable. So that's on the one side. Urban development, slightly better, but if you look at us in compared to our continental neighbours, then I think the quality in terms of standards, the internal layouts, and in particular the environmental performance falls an awful long way short. And we're also building at excessive density in parts of London. Having said, in the countryside we're building at under 30 dwellings per hectare in certain locations. I've looked at schemes in parts of West London which have gone to 3,500 per hectare. Now, that density is an odd thing. You can't say there's a right and a wrong density, but when you get anything near that level, you have to ask fundamental questions about whether that works in terms of daylight, single aspect, dual aspect, kids' play space. They fail on almost every grounds. And because a lot of housing is becoming niche now, build to rent, for example, let alone the sort of shared units that are being built. The space standards are being squeezed down. We are providing some of the worst housing standards in Europe.
So when you refer to low quality of housing in London, in high density developments, do you refer to space standards? Mostly when you said internal layouts, internal standards.
Yeah, well, both. There are, and I wouldn't like to hazard a guess as what an upper limit would be in terms of density. But when you test high density schemes, and you apply simple tests such as dual aspect, decent internal space standards, access to open space, access to kids' play space, then they're fairly loading of corridors and front doors and lift cores. And that's actually getting worse post-Grenfell with the need to put in extra lift cores. So now our standards are bad, and it should be a national debate because it's becoming a national disgrace. But it has been a disgrace for about 20 years.
So you said you were also chairing design panels. What are the difficulties you face when substandard developments are sort of being proposed?
It's a colossal failure of the planning system, isn't it?
Okay.
Both at national policy level and locally. Actually, I'm quite a fan of the British planning system. when it's worked well and when people know how to use it. But that's becoming rarer and rarer. Planning policy should dictate land values, not the other way round. And the introduction by this government about 10 years ago of viability testing was a bizarre idea. You know, if it's not viable, you pay too much for your land or your development costs are too high. It's not a fault of the planning system. So to get decent housing, we have to sort out land reform. And we have to change the way in which land is acquired and land is valued. And at the moment, it's pushed so high, including by higher and higher densities, that the squeeze comes at the planning end, at the quality end. And that'll happen until you can keep planning policy constant for 15 years. Planning changes don't make any impact. If you tighten up policy, then people will land bank land and will hold back on development. So you have to have a constant policy, so it works right the way through into a re-evaluation of land values. And if in the meantime people can't build or developers go bust, that's just the tough way the market works. But at the moment we've seen planning as the link you can change and you can remove to make unacceptable schemes built, to see them built. Secondly, when you get to local level, you need planners who are capable enough and experienced enough and confident enough to negotiate and actually make sure that they don't accept substandard, they don't go for the expedient, and they're backed by their political representatives. That is also failing quite badly.
Would you then say, improving the standards is somehow futile because it's not consistently applied?
Well, standards are there and can be enforced, but they are relaxed.
Yeah.
Or they're chipped away at through viability statements, as are other things such as architectural design and the environmental performance. So we're constantly going for lowest common denominator in the housing that we're building. And we have a shortage. And we haven't even talked about affordability.
No. So in that sense, apart from planning, do you see any aspects that require more tighter regulations or standards?
Well, I'd like to see far, far tighter environmental standards.
Environmental standards?
Yeah. The fact that, we are double glazing, we're very, very rarely triple glazed in this country. Passive house is something which is occasionally brought in, but it's very, very much the exception rather than the rule. And the environmental standards in terms of operational carbon are lower than they should be, and we're barely scratching the surface of embodied carbon.
Regarding your early comment earlier that any planning, if it's sort of tightened, it should be consistently done so for at least 15 years to be impactful, right? That's what you said. So, in London, starting from when you were also working for Design for London, but sort of the promotion of new space standards or high quality housing, do you think that had an impact in London's quality?
Yes,
quality?
no, I it did, and if I look back on the time I had a Design for London, probably the biggest achievement we had was the London Housing Design Guide, which it was never intended to have the impact that it had. I was very pleased it has, but there was political opposition to it. Not strangely enough, there's a sense of it'll just turn the tap off on housing, just turn off the tap on housing. And the only way we got it published was to say that it would only apply to London Authority owned land. And then we got it applied to London Authority owned land and funded schemes through the Housing Corporation. And then it became part of the London Plan. and large amounts of it have been taken nationally. It's
Yeah.
almost a default standard nationally, and actually it was a good document. I'm biased, but it was a good document. It was a good document because it didn't just look at internal space standards, and we tried to think about housing in terms of the quality you'd have living in it. So everything from the journey from the bus stop to the front door, loading of corridors, internal spaces, lifetime housing, but in particular the idea of dual aspect actually really has had an impact. And but having said that, there's still people who are putting in slightly twisted balconies and saying, oh, it's dual aspect, there's an angle there. It is a dual aspect, it's about cross ventilation, not about being able to have two slightly different views northwards, which is what we're seeing in certain schemes. So no, it did have a very, very big impact. And that is one example where you can introduce housing. And we were worried, actually, when we wrote it, especially when it went into the London plan, and we had it tested commercially to see what impact it would make, but it had no impact, no noticeable impact at all on the volume of house building.
Well, from our research, I can tell there's a huge difference between space standards in London, or compliance with space standards in London, in both funded and not so funded schemes, and outside London, it's significantly different still.
That's counterintuitive, isn't it? Because land values are not higher in London.
Yeah.
Although, actually, property values are higher as
Yeah.
well. But no, that's really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, that's what
That
we
actually
find.
introducing good standards doesn't actually stop the market building. The market will stop and reflect, then work out different ways to do it. Developers are pretty clever, actually. They're pretty good at their business. And you set them challenges, and they will rise to them.
Yeah.
There's this sense of, oh, you mustn't challenge it because we're in a crisis, it can only get worse. But no.
Also, in terms of the planning, sort of affordable housing capture through Section 106.
Yeah.
In London, it's quite higher than outside London.
Yeah, but
and
not
it's more
high,
consistent.
nothing like high enough.
Yeah.
That is the problem as well. And it's a totally separate subject, but expecting the private sector to provide affordable housing is not, in my view, a realistic expectation. No more than expecting the private sector, when they build houses, to build your hospitals and schools. Yeah. These are public goods, and lack of affordable housing is a market failure, and that's where state intervention comes in to address it, as we've always have done until about 2003, by putting in grants. And it's the drying up of housing association grants that has had a big impact also on poor quality housing, because without that grant subsidy, trying to make it actually match up commercially is incredibly difficult.
Yeah, because that's when shared ownership
Yeah.
comes into play.
Yeah.
So I guess going back to the London Design Guide and perhaps changing the definition of standard to being similar. In London, we are seeing that more and more the housing is looking very similar.
Yeah.
Particularly new developments. Do you think do you think standards somehow play a role in this?
Yeah, they do. In some ways, the London Housing Design Guide was a bit like changing building regulations. And looking out of this window, what we see is a vernacular shaped after the profile of London and then adapted through building regs. And I think it's quite interesting on the Housing Design Guide has had an impact on architecture. That was never the intention, but I suppose inevitably it does. There aren't that many variations you have on a tall residential building.
Yeah.
In terms of its balconies, its fenestration, its shape. And once you start introducing dual aspect, you have quite a fundamental impact. Once you require houses to have balconies, you have a fundamental impact, and therefore we have seen almost a London vernacular emerge. Not necessarily bad. Georgian vernacular is something which we value hugely. It's simplicity in design, simplicity and consistency. So there's nothing wrong with that at all. And I'd rather see that, good, robust, simple, well-designed housing than each one vying to be an architectural masterpiece, which would just be an architectural mess in a city.
Is there another argument that where the standards sort of limit flexibility?
In what way?
Flexibility in design and flexibility in the
Yes,
form?
they can do, and I think there's a very interesting debate on the margins of the Housing Design Guide about the extent to which you might be able to produce good or even better housing by tweaking it. And there are developers like Pocket Living, for example, big advocates of this, and I'm sort of convinced, not entirely, but sort of convinced, that you can, by really clever design, produce equally good, if not better, internal layouts without necessarily going to each square metre has to be allocated according to the design standard. But the London Housing Design Guide was never meant to be a form of building regulations. And we always said that if you applied every policy in it to the letter, you would never be able to build a single unit of housing. But planning is flexible. And the big concern we had when it became part of the planning process was that in the hands of a planner who just saw it as every regulation has to be ticked off, it would be really restrictive. But generally speaking, it's used fairly flexibly. And you can produce good housing outside the design guide, but it's the exception. And it should be demonstrated. It's not the norm because the guide is wrong.
I maybe have a follow-up. If right now that you said that planning is flexible, kind of, but also depending who reads the design guide, do you feel like the design guide was intended for architects and designers, or also for a wider audience?
Designers. The objective when we were writing it was it should sit on every architect's desk there, just as a reference document. And we wrote it very much so you could pick up, easy to navigate, and actually extract the information you needed to produce compliant housing.
What was the process of gathering evidence or sort of writing that document in terms of who were inputting? Were there any sort of live projects going on where these were being tested, or were there sort of research committees doing some research, example housing?
It was produced relatively quickly, and it wasn't the basis of a large academic research exercise. Yeah, arguably it should have been, but it wasn't. And we brought in Alex Ely a man with huge experience and a track record of studying good housing. We did look extensively at examples across the rest of Europe, or certainly Northern Europe, and we drew on that very, very heavily. And then we drew on other literature as well. So it did have a research base, but it was not a piece of academic research. It was meant to be a practical application. So it was applied research, I suppose. And the other thing is, it was written by practitioners for practitioners, I suppose. The key thing about it.
Wasn't there a live project in Bonn? Was it about density?
Sorry?
Wasn't there a live project that...
There might have been. I honestly can't remember.
Oh,
to
okay.
be honest. There might have been.
There
was a lot of work happening on density at the time. And HTA, for example, did work on density, and one or two other groups, I must say the name I've forgotten, did very, very good work at high density living, and the excessive densities were becoming an issue then when we voted, because the density caps had been taken off the London plan. There was a fear it will become a free-for-all. It did, and it's still going on in certain areas.
That reminds me of another finding we had. So we compared developments completed in the last 2 years in London and outside London. One of the things we found is that housing quality indicators, the standards that kind of preceded London Design Guide, were still being applied into houses, sort of volume house builder portfolios were actually HQI compliant, and in London they were higher because HQIs are lower than the space standards that proposed in London Design Guide. One of the things we could come up with is that because London Housing Design Guide was produced with high density block of flats in mind, and they are not perhaps directly translatable to sort of in terms of space standards to houses. As do you have any opinion on that?
Oh yes, no, I do. I think there's a pressing need actually for somebody to address housing outside, suburban and rural housing. And I said earlier about the incredibly low densities and how poor a lot of the housing is, and it is poor. It's produced by volume house builders. Some volume house builders are good, but an awful lot aren't. And because of a housing shortage, you can always sell housing. So I think there's a pressing need to look at how we produce housing outside our cities. And in particular, density, but also typologies. Why almost every development you see is detached houses, all sitting on their own, one after another, closely spaced, with 3 bedrooms. We don't have a tradition here of marketing housing in terms of floor space, which we should do. We barely have a tradition in terms of environmental performance. There is a checklist, but it's pretty rudimentary and crude. And I think we have to rethink housing typologies. And you could argue, I'm not necessarily arguing now, you could argue that we should actually ban the detached house. A detached house is, is not as environmentally efficient as a semi-detached, and far less so than a terrace. If you look at a lot of relatively lower density housing across Europe, you get the idea of the terrace, which we are pretty familiar with in Britain, is a standard unit. The idea of terraces. A lot of English villages actually in their high streets have terraces. I don't know why we just don't rethink the typologies. I think there's a big research exercise to look at housing outside the city centres. Especially, as you said, the London Housing Design Guide has pushed standards up in London, but not elsewhere.
Do you have any other questions?
Yes, I mean, I think coming back to kind of how the design guides are intended for practitioners, I think throughout your experience, how have you seen the role of the architect or the role of the designer change in how housing is provided?
I'm not convinced I can really answer that question. No, I'm not convinced I have. I think certainly certain things are becoming more mainstream. Yes, the Housing Design Guide standards has become mainstream. Better environmental performance is becoming mainstream, but nothing like as far push as it should be. No, I don't think so. I think it's a lack of imagination in layouts and how we use internal space, partly held back by how housing is marketed. It has 3 bedrooms. so what? How big is it? How big's the living room? What's the dimension of the living room? Big difference between 3.5 metres and 4 metres in living room width. Kitchen, dining, living room is not necessarily a good idea. And a few years ago I did a lot of work in Korea, and initially was rather shocked by these incredibly thin pencil blocks for housing. Normally about 24 to 30 stories, incredibly thin, all look the same, so much so that they have to be numbered so you know where you live. But when you go inside, the internal layouts were fantastic. 4 units per lift core, each with dual aspect, each with two different balconies on either face of the building. They had walk-in dressing rooms, walk-in pantries, had largely dispensed with the entrance hall, had 4.5 metre wide living rooms and 2.3, 2.4 metre floor to ceiling height. I mean, it was very simple. When you went in, you went, oh, I could live here. And I brought a whole lot back. I'm meaning to use them sometime. And compared to what we're building here, it's rather kind of stifled here. And it'd be really interesting to see people begin to really look at far more flexible use of space.
And I think just another question I had, coming back to what you said about that the design guide was made rather quick, and if it were to be done again now, what sort of evidence do you think would be or should have been added?
I think, interesting question. I think there's certain areas which we haven't bottomed out. One is privacy and proximity. Different things, but privacy and proximity. And I think that one thing which I think I'd have liked to look at again is ground floor units and the excessive privacy we're designing for ground floor units. Now, if you live in central London, part of the pleasure is staring into people's basement kitchens. And if you live there, staring back at people walking along. I mean, it's very sociable. This idea you have to have screens, they have to be raised with privet hedges, and it's just bad design. And then we talk about lack of surveillance, and we say you need a shop. But actually residential gives you a lot of passive surveillance if you open up. The Dutch do this brilliantly well, of course. So I think looking at ground floor units would be a particular thing. Looking at proximity as to how close can you put one building to another, and ways in which you can offset, the obvious invasiveness of being able to peer into somebody's bedroom. And then the third thing would be to really push the environmental standards up. The passive house would be the standard, and you'd have to absolutely justify why you're not going for a passive house. Now, a passive house in modern apartment blocks is very, very rare still, and that is where it's very easy to do it, far easier than houses, and yet it's becoming something which is not being pursued.
And for example, post-occupancy studies, do you see their use in kind of informing standards, or do you feel like all these multiple subjectivities would just be very difficult to translate into design?
Post-occupancy studies, there are very, very few of those, aren't there?
Yeah.
I guess probably the big gap in research. I know the volume of house builders don't do them. I don't know how much research is done on post-occupancy. I bet you'll know that better than I, and imagine there is quite a bit of research being done. But we spoke to house builders when we did the design guide, and we asked them that question, and they all looked as if we were mad. We don't go back. Why would we? We've sold them. So there seems, for them, the test of quality is the selling price. We built it, we sold it, there was demand, people like it, or they wouldn't have bought it. That works with cars, doesn't actually work with housing where there's a net shortage. But post-occupancy, we're really important. And actually really get down to the level of how people really use their houses. And I don't think it has happened since the design guide, of course, is COVID, working from home. Now, I don't know how people manage that. Yeah, if you've got a nice Victorian or Edwardian house, then you've got plenty of space, and you have a desk and all the rest of it, and you can escape for the kids, and the kids have a homework area. If you're living in a 1 or 2 bedroom flat with kids, or a couple sharing a 1 bed flat, it's the kitchen table or the bedside table, isn't it? And now some house builders are beginning to think about how we build in workspace in quite a sophisticated way. But again, that's very, very much in the infancy. It's like, the other thing we did it now, the working from home environment would be a major thing. And I think the other thing, the area which hasn't really been explored to anything like this anymore, is the extent you can miniaturize design. Compare a modern apartment with a yacht, or compare it with a standard production estate car, and the clever use of space in automobile or yacht design is very, very good to see it. And I think you could look at miniaturization with certain things, not miniaturizing the whole unit, but within the standard envelope, the House and Design Guide specifies standard envelope, you could put in 1 or 2 extra bathroom pods, for example. You could put in a workspace, you could put in better storage, better cupboards, certainly better wiring and wiring infrastructure. I think that is probably, again, another thing we'll be looking at if we redid the design guide now.
We talked about space standards and environmental standards. There's one way, there's a other way of looking at this, that increasing standards also increases consumption of energy, housing, floor, etc., material. So what would you say about that?
Well, if we move beyond the environmental standards, it's the making housing very energy efficient, but also very energy comfortable. Things like natural ventilation. Although actually you can't have them in a passive house, can you? So that's a kind of. But thinking about things like that. But energy consumption is the other really big thing that's happened. But if we cranked up our environmental standards, we'd be addressing that anyway, I think.